You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Lord Uther, and today our recurring host, Tuck Pendleton. Welcome, gentlemen, welcome.
Hello.
We are talking about two of the more intense episodes of Star Trek, the original series this week, both of which have some interesting backstories and interesting implications on the series. And I'm going to go right out on a limb here and say that both are very much classic Trek cast interactions and play very well into future movies and episodes of Star Trek. I don't want to waste any time here. Tuck Pendleton, let's hear what we've got behind the scenes.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to all of you Star Trek fans here at home and abroad. We hope you had a wonderful holiday weekend. If you were in the celebratory mood, all of us here at Pending Rebrand, we're stuffed with both turkey and knowledge, and we want to share at least one with you. We're going to talk Trek. We're going to talk The Devil in the Dark. First broadcast on March 9th, 1967. We have returning champion director Joseph Pevney behind the camera. And at the typewriter, Gene Kuhn, showrunner, producer, and writer. And this is a special treat for this week's Warp Core. We'll get two Gene Kuhn episodes this week, back to back. So when we started Star Trek, Roddenberry's mandate was get the best science fiction writers on this show and see what we can do. And we had Richard Matheson and Joseph Bloch and some of these other non-television writers contributing early on and building the foundations for the show. As the first season has progressed, as we wind our way down to the climax of this first cycle of episodes, you see DC Fontana and Gene Kuhn taking more and more of the creative rudder and doing a lot of writing and rewriting and so forth. So now the show has found a voice, has fleshed out what it wants the characters to be, and is taking them in those directions. So we've sort of telescoped it back down now to a more traditional writer's room and presentation, whereas when the seasons started, it was a little bit more of a smorgasbord, a salad bar, a sampling of, well, let's try this or maybe this. So that's where we stand as we come around the home stretch. This episode, The Devil in the Dark, could have been a Halloween episode because it does play with classic horror tropes and ominous atmosphere and so forth. And it takes some big swings, and we'll talk about those as we go on. It's the first use of the Leonard Bones McCoy catchphrase, "I'm a doctor, Jim, not a blank." And trivia points, in this particular episode, we kick off that trope with, "I'm a doctor, Jim, not a bricklayer." So here at the Warp Core, we'll keep track of every time Leonard Bones McCoy utters that famous phrase with whatever he adds into at the end there. This is also one of William Shatner's favorite episodes. And you might say to yourself, well, he delivers a compelling performance. He shows some character growth, going from this extreme to this extreme and so forth. But it's actually a more personal reason. During production, his father died while they were shooting, and instead of taking some time off to grieve him and so forth, which I'm sure he did, he insisted on keeping to the schedule, a very tight television schedule, whether it was in the 60s, the 80s, or today. And he wanted the show to go on. So, and obviously it doesn't necessarily register in terms of his performance. He's a professional after all. But apparently there was an intense personal loss, and he's associated that with this, but he has happy memories of this. And like I say, cites this as one of his all-time favorites as James Tiberius Kirk. So anyways, just a couple of quick random thoughts before we send it out to you guys. The opening is very much like a horror picture, although it does have the classic "let's leave the victim all by himself," so that the monster, the unseen monster, can grab him. The first victim is Schmitter. That's the only name he gets, but boy, he only needs that one. And I just thought that was it made me chuckle as they say, "Schmitter, stay here and guard this, and we'll come back and get you in 4 hours." Even though the place is massive, clear evidence there's been some sort of disturbance, and they know that people have gone missing or otherwise been killed. But it's up to Schmitter. Sadly, he's not up to the task, and he ends up burned to a charcoal briquette, and that's what launches us into, basically the Enterprise versus the monster of the week. This would fit right at home in with the X-Files. You almost imagine Dana Scully and Fox Mulder like being called in, a mining company. And it also has a great, I won't say that this is the first time we've ever seen this, but it has the classic mankind is meddling with nature, whether it's a underwater mining company or in this case, an interplanetary mining company. They always break through this new level with their technology and inevitably unleash chaos and destruction that they can't control. And that's, like I say, there's the constant and many examples of this. And it has become literally a cliche of the horror genre, but it was fun to hear. Like, we broke through on level 23, and then all of a sudden, bad stuff started happening because man should never have crossed that threshold with the miners there. So the big takeaway I have with this one, for me, and again, we're looking at this through a 2023 lens. We've grown up with ILM and WIDA and Digital Domain and all of these amazing special effects houses, and what we were able to do with computer CGI, with models, with makeup, with digital, just pure digital effects. It's extraordinary, and that's an entire other podcast entirely in terms of just the gains made from 1967 to 2024 and beyond. But even in this case, gentlemen, we build up a tense atmosphere. We have these unseen glimpses of the creature, a la Jaws, where we don't know quite what's happening, but there's people obviously meeting gruesome ends. And then we have the reveal. And, like I say, they had to work with what they had to work with. I actually feel the emotion of the creature trying to defend its young. And I anthropomorphized it as more like a pet, like an aging dog or cat, like, in that sense. But it does squeeze a little of the air out of the balloon, because it is kind of a silly looking creature. My first thought when they picked up a piece of it and were examining it was, we used to have this, they called it Mexican pizza in our high school. They literally called it that. That wasn't some bad student like slang. Like, that was what was on the menu. And it was a round disc pizza with little sausage crumbles and little like green and red peppers on it. It was delicious. I would eat that now 4 times a week if I could get my hands on it. But it looked like they were holding a slice of this high school pizza and so forth. And again, I'm not gonna tear it apart, because there's more to the episode thematically and so forth than that. But it just, sitting from my lofty perch here in 2023, I just thought, man, I wish they might have gone in a humanoid direction or something a little less silly looking. But I think what we need to talk about is Kirk's switch, right? That's the major character moment. Well, one of them in this entire episode is Kirk starts off saying, we need this mining. We need this trialium and dilithium, whatever they're, trying to get their hands on. And the monster must be killed at all costs. This mine, we're not abandoning this, etc. We're gonna find the problem, root it out, and destroy it. And it's Kirk, without prompting. Spock is trying to talk him out of it, and he's like, "No, absolutely not. We are, this thing is dead. We're gonna kill it." And then Kirk, on his own, shifts that, with his encounter with the beast, and suddenly then becomes an espousal of protecting it and giving it its space, and comes up with the solution, the grand compromise that's necessary. And again, we've seen a lot of Kirk. We've seen him in action, making captainly decisions. We've talked, how much he loves the Enterprise. We've talked about his virtues, but this one was interesting to me in terms of how he came, sort of his own little personal journey, how he got from this side of the spectrum to there regarding it. So I throw it out to Ursa and Uther as to, what this adds to the character of Jim Kirk, and how Bill Shatner, during this intense personal time off camera, how he conveyed, that character switch, and what you guys thought of it.
I thought it was great. I mean, it was an intense, emotional episode. I think from, even without that backstory about William Shatner, I think it was conveyed really well how he was weighing duty against reality, the scientific reality. I think he took Spock's, caution to heart, and Spock was just like, logically, I will follow orders. It does make sense. We do need this mining colony. And you see again that logic versus emotion interplay. But Kirk, I think, as he's displayed to varying degrees thus far, he has that capacity for emotional rationale and development throughout an episode. But this one was a little less obvious. It was a little more artful. It was seeing this sort of unique but meek creature. I mean, it looks like grandma's old rug, right? I mean, it was not an impressive special effects monster, but I think it was kind of nice that they did that, because had it been humanoid, like say a tar monster a la Tasha Yar, you would have had a little less sympathy for it. But this is just sort of a small kind of, I don't know, like horseshoe crab type thing, which is, it's a little creepy, but it's also kind of cute. And in a way, it's kind of like, do we really have to kill this? Like, right. You get a little bit of this, say it's the fox in the hen house. You see the fox. The fox is actually pretty cute. Maybe it's even friendly to a point, and you're like, boy, do I really have to shoot this? Like,
right.
I don't want to. And you see this play out in Kirk's face, and, the Vulcan mind meld is the first thing I think that should always come to mind. Why it doesn't get used more often throughout the series is kind of weird. But, Kirk has that amazing capacity as a captain to make those snap decisions that are not impulsive. They're very well thought out and articulated. And that's the beauty of the balance between McCoy and Spock at his left and right hand, is that he can synthesize these very logical decisions, but also very emotionally based ones. And the way that plays out, it's a huge moment of development. I could see where, Bill Shatner at the time, going through what he's going through personally, this plays soft. It's kind of like, in a way, it's almost like a childlike creature to a father-like figure, somebody who is literally responsible for your life and death. And he has to step into that role and kind of protect this creature that's just killed, 50 men. So like, it's an amazing kind of, way that's acted out, and how that kind of ties into what he was going through personally. He used that emotionally extremely difficult time in his life and leveraged it in a way that brought some life to his character that I think, again, this is why we talk how these episodes are foundational. It brought a little something to Kirk that makes him greater than Star Trek. It elevates his character to something that is going to last longer than a series, because it's a character that has real humanity, but is also larger than life, and it's very cool to see.
I had to unmute myself. Great leaders can pivot, right, and they can change. The leaders who struggle to lead are the ones that will never go back on something they've said or a command they've given, right? So a great leader can reflect and can respond versus react, because I think those are two different things. And even though we see the emotion in Kirk, because he's an emotional guy, he's also someone who will, check himself in a sense and listen to the people around him. Not all leaders do that. So I think that's something important to note there too. And I don't know about you guys, but do they drink a lot of coffee in the original series? Because like they land on that planet and it's time for coffee, like right away. It's like, pour me a cup of coffee, and they're having their coffee and they're talking through these things. They consume a lot of coffee.
And they're little Dixie cups of coffee too. I thought that was really, like, why in the future do they have these little paper cups? Like, where did this come along?
Right.
Nice.
And so I found that very funny. And we kind of get a Data moment with Spock, by the way, because Kirk asks about the odds. I think he asks about the odds, or no, Spock presents the odds about, will we survive this? And it's, and they kind of try to turn it into a comical moment without putting in the music, which I think helped, because Spock's like, 247.8. I have the number off a little bit. I had my notes somewhere. I can't find them, but he was like, the chances of this happening are 2,478.4 to 1. And then he's like, but he said it's like, that's a guess, or it wasn't as accurate. And Kirk's like, that's not accurate. Or he was talking about the odds. But anyway,
those are pretty good odds, Mr. Spock. I guess you can stay.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yes,
so we kind of, we get that moment with the odds. So I thought that was a nice little touch there. I also like McCoy, even though he says I'm not a bricklayer, he winds up getting the concrete and fixing this wounded animal, Horta, and fixing him up, or fixing that animal up as well. So I thought Nimoy's, again, we see the depth of his acting, because like he's throwing some emotion out there when he's mind melding with the Horta, but you can see it on his face. So that's been the great thing. And this is something I think Ethan Peck pulls off very, very well, going from the logical, supposed to be kind of unemotional Spock, and can just switch it, throw the switch, and all of a sudden he's all full of emotion, to the point that you can almost feel it. Like you could almost feel the pain that this animal had, that Spock was relaying to everybody. So I think that was another very strong point of this episode. And to your point there, UrzaMaster, that you kind of like, you feel for this thing in a sense, even though, like you said, if it was a humanoid type of creature, you might have felt differently. But here you can almost relate it to a dog, where you're feeling like you don't want this thing to be in pain. And Spock's able to convey that to the audience. So I think that was another pretty important point, part of this episode as well.
Pain.
And that was one of the best mind melds they've done to date. Sorry. That's all I wanted to say. It was just like great mind meld moments. The air mind meld and then the body mind meld. Oh, so good.
Again, the whether or not with Nimoy, emoting, you can tell at the time. Again, let's all remember that when he was first workshopping this character in the cage and where no man has gone before, he wasn't playing it exactly cool as a cucumber Vulcan. So we have seen him before where he was a little bit more caffeinated, even more so than all the coffee they've been drinking. But the audiences at the time of Star Trek, when this was airing, had not seen any of that footage. Ergo, they only knew Spock as a cool, calm, logic-based being. So for him to lower that curtain and toss that out, this must have been stunning, like to the first thing, like, oh my gosh, he's like, he's speaking differently and he's writhing in sort of agony. That must have been quite a shock, to fans who have already established their thoughts of who Spock was. And we just saw him being sort of playful and rebellious in This Side of Paradise, which we talked about in our previous Warp Core episode. So make sure that you check out our commentary on that. Hit that subscribe button below, and you'll get a very varied glimpse of all the things Mr. Nimoy can do. But to Lord Uther's point, the real strength of that moment is when he goes from pure emotion. I think Kirk tells him, Spock, that's enough. And it's all registered in, as you say, on his face. Like suddenly we see Logic Spock without a word of dialogue. We see him like recompose, reset himself, and we realize that the next thing he'll say will be in that sort of dry monotone that he likes to command as the first officer. So a great moment there, just to be able to communicate with an economy. It's just in his posture. You could just see his face, kind of some of the worry lines just disappear, and he becomes again the Spock that we all know and love there. So there were some musical stingers in here. Again, you had sort of an intense, scary episode. I'm sure the 8-year-olds at the time were like hiding behind the couch, like, oh no. So they did put in a couple of Desilu kind of like wah-wahs in there. Nothing like they did on Shore Leave. I think Alexander Courage on Shore Leave, he might have just had one too many coffees, because that was certainly the standard by which we judge these things. But this one had a couple of them. But I liked the little bit at the end. We've talked about how they kind of wrap the episode up with sort of a, little punch on the shoulder and a little, comic bit to send you off on a high. They're talking and about Spock saying that, the Horta found him to be intelligent and resourceful. And I think it's Kirk that's like, she really liked those ears. And I thought that was, if you're going to do one of those wah-wah kind of lines, I thought that was pretty good there for the crew overall. So I like the actor who played Vanderberg, who was the union leader of this planet. And he just seemed like a real tough guy, right? From Chicago or Philly or something. Like, this is a guy that if you got into an argument at a sports bar, he'd knock your block off. He was played by Ken Lynch. And like I said, we'll probably never see him again. And he was probably just a working actor, but he just had this sort of pugnacious face and delivery vocally. I'm just like, man, I don't want to be, I'm not sure what I'd be more afraid to be in a corridor with, the creature or this guy, if he, had a wrench and so forth. He was a tough union guy.
I thought that was kind of interesting here. This whole mining crew felt like real, miners. Like if you went to a mining town, I think of, the North Range here in Minnesota, the Iron Range. If I went into, even today, any given small town bar up there in Virginia or Eveleth or something, this is the crowd of dudes I would run into. Now they might be a little more heavier set these days, a little more gray, but certainly back in the era, I feel like, and the paper cups probably right in line with the way they drank coffee. I feel like these are the miners, and I thought that was very interesting because they didn't. I think as television shows these days try to do, and certainly they strove a little bit for in Star Trek's era, was they didn't like force a type of cast into this role. This was all like your Pittsburghs, you're right there, your Pittsburghers, if you will. You know, a bunch of dudes with the same haircut, same, you know, probably ethnic background, all working for the man every night and day, trying to get by and feed their families. But remember, they're all in this mining colony by themselves. Like,
Right.
it's kind of a weird, like, they have families there. They don't have anybody else there. It's just like 80 of these dudes together, just like, well, I guess we're going to get some rocks today, fellas. Like, of course they drink coffee all the time, you know, and of course they're all high strung, you know, they got all the poison running through their veins. Like, this is probably a wild place to work. And I know that was probably about as subtextual or as non-textual as you can get, but I was thinking like, geez, what a horrible, horrible place to be working is in this mine colony forever, ostensibly, where you like, what's your shore leave like? You know, these guys are the ones who probably save up their ducats and go to Ryza for 2 weeks every year.
Nice.
I wanted to throw that out there.
I also liked how we got Scotty rigging something up. I think this is one of the first times he's rigging something together to keep something going. Right. And I kind of liked, you know, how much time do you have? You know, like, oh, maybe 10 hours, you know, like he's throwing that out. He's giving his estimation on how long the thing might last.
But he's a miracle worker.
Nice that's right. So it was kind of, I feel like it was his first time having to work a miracle, because I don't think that's really been brought up yet in the series.
No, not really. No.
Although, I think this is our first time.
On
interesting
the Galileo,
point, though.
On the Galileo 7.
Okay.
But yes, this is definitely one of the early instances, you bet.
Interesting point, though, the reactor that they're talking about, Scotty makes a remark that he hasn't seen one of these in 20 years, kind of like making the underhanded joke, like, this thing's obsolete. What am I going to do with this? Then flash forward to Star Trek 3, the Enterprise is 20 years old. And you just see the pain on Scotty's face. Talk about full circle. I mean, there's no way they didn't count that into effect when they talked about the Enterprise in Star Trek 3, because, you know, Scotty's like, well, wait a minute, 20 years old or not, I can make it work because he did it once, and here's your proof in the pudding. So if you have subscribed pending rebrand, and if you haven't, definitely do now, go back and watch our episode on Star Trek 3. Compare it with this episode, Scotty, and I think you'll see where the two definitely start to overlap pretty heavy. And you can see why, again, we call this first season of Star Trek foundational for many, many reasons. These are the characterizations that become the rest of the character.
Outstanding. And a quick shout out to Schmitter, played by Biff Elliott. And the only thing better than his character name is his actual Christian name. So Biff Elliott, we hardly knew you, but thanks for taking one for the team in the pre-episode before the credits. So, all right, well then something happened. I mean, we talked about 1967 and all the wonderful, terrible things that were going on in the country and so forth. But Star Trek did not air on March 16th, the horror. So audiences had to wait 2 whole weeks for the next episode, Errand of Mercy, which was on March 23rd, 1967. So perhaps there's a mystery there. What took the place of NBC programming? Why was Star Trek pushed back? Actually, I think it's probably a more banal understanding. They were having, again, logistical, you know, with scripts and special effects and things stacking up, you know, the ability to churn it out, even at a 1960s pace. They may have just not had anything ready to go for that. But in any event, 2 weeks later, we pick up, and boy, was this a doozy. Brand new director to the show, John Newland, and as mentioned before, written by Gene L. Kuhn. Obviously, this was the first episode that dealt directly with the Klingons. They were described in the script simply as Oriental and hard-faced. And before I even go into any more of the episode's backstory, let's really quick, gentlemen. For such a foundational race that we've seen in every iteration of Star Trek since, I need your initial hits as to how they envisioned the Klingons, particularly the supporting Klingons. We'll talk about the leader, and I know that UrzaMaster is going to be excited about discussing Gore. But what did you think of the Klingons' makeup and personalities, just as they are first introduced to us?
I think it's interesting. In a lot of ways, the leader definitely. Well, we'll get to Gore, but the supporting Klingons really do reminisce of the Klingons I knew growing up from the Next Generation. Even though the look is obviously quite different, the characterization's pretty close. They're obedient, sort of brutal, but not like, they aren't like other alien races we see, which are just, viciously brutal. There's definitely a sort of a connate kind of vibe to them. It feels very, Attila the Hun or something to that effect. But in a way that's, they haven't really like lost the effect I think they wanted. I think they wanted the brutal nature of the Klingons to really be their subjugation more so than their physical prowess. Although I think they hint at both being very much a thing. And I think later Star Trek kind of leans a little bit heavier into the physical prowess versus the subjugation. But I do think that the interesting play here is that you get something most Star Trek episodes to this date really haven't given you. You don't get this show of hatred between these two races. There's all this negative talk of Klingons, but Kirk, literally hates these guys, doesn't even know them. And I love the subtextual obvious parallels between everything that was going on in the era and even today. It's very much a human story of two opposing sides that hate each other, that really maybe just don't understand each other all that well, and losing their ability to make war with each other kind of forces them to face down peace. Facing down peace is just always more difficult than facing down war. To a certain extent just makes sense. And like the corporeal versions of these incorporeal beings kind of says is like, hey, we won't allow you to make violence. You have to work this out. This is the real difficult part. The difficult part, like Kirk wants them to actually fight a war in the episode where the computers are fighting each other because, hey, war is hell and you need to experience it so you can confront peace. The vice versa here. Peace is hell. It's hard to achieve peace. It's hard to come to terms and realize your common grounds and, talk things out and much easier to resort to your instances of war. And this is a really great self-reflective episode, not just for Star Trek canon, but just for humanity. And that's like, you talk about the beauty of Roddenberry's writing and science fiction as a whole always speaks to the greater human condition. And this is like, the cream of the crop when it comes to drawing some sort of a real life parallel. And that's before you even get to Gore and Kirk and the mastery of acting that is that interaction.
Let's mention him now. The actor who plays Gore is John Kaliskos of Greek heritage. You'll recognize him, science fiction fans of a certain age. He was the original Baltar in Battlestar Galactica, the 1978 iteration. And UrzaMaster will tell you that the character of Gore will reappear in the animated series, as well as a classic triptych of episodes from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Blood Oath, The Sword of Kallus, and Once More Unto the Breach. So if you jump forward a century to the Rick Berman era of Star Trek, you can revisit Gore in a much different context. This one, in particular, and I want to throw this back to Lord Uther and UrzaMaster sign in there. This is the first, again, encounter with a very hostile race to the Starfleet. We've had the Romulans in Balance of Terror, and we've had the Klingons now in Errand of Mercy. So I directed specifically to Lord Uther first, but Urza, chime in here if you will. We've had, standalone episodes where we've had these two races that are not fans of the Federation. Which one is more intimidating just based on these first impressions? I know we have to kind of try and vacuum off things like that we later will know, Klingons and Romulans in later editions, but which one is scarier? Which one is meaner? Which one are you like, oh, I really want to, beat these guys based on what they've shown us in these first seasons? And I want to start with Uther on that one. Klingons versus Romulans.
Well, I think from a Kirk perspective, Klingons are worse. I mean, at least that's the way it was kind of coming across. I think threat-wise, I almost felt like the Romulans were more of the threat to the Federation. At least that's how I kind of felt about it. I also think it was interesting, though, that the Klingon Federation alliance is foretold in this episode. Like the Organians, which to me would be Princess Leia Organa, but that's a whole nother story. Click subscribe. Anyway, like they foretell this alliance that's going to wind up happening. So again, with the knowledge that we have, it's maybe that's why, because looking back on it, we know what happened. So to go backwards and look at it and wonder if the Klingons are really that much more of a threat. I mean, the tension was obviously there, probably because you have the two of them in the same room together, right? Like, so you can get more of that Klingon Federation tension, but I still feel like more of the Kirk Klingon tension, where I feel like the Romulans came off as more of a threat because they seem to be a little sneakier and not so much in your face as the Klingons were. And there's also seems to be this moral, Kirk seems to be trying to take the high ground with the Federation, almost like a moralistic side to it, but he's talking about going to war and wanting to kill them, and he's not exactly coming off as a peacekeeping Federation type of person during all of this either, which I thought was interesting because it kind of cast him in a different light, or maybe even the Federation in a little bit different of a light, almost making it out to be like it's his life mission to destroy Klingons or something like that. It came off that strong.
And this is before David. I mean, think about how that.
Yeah.
I mean,
So I guess it begs the question: are we gonna see something at some point that makes Kirk hate them that much? Because there's really no precedent for this, right? I mean, is there a story behind this that he despises them? Not that I know of.
Yeah, I mean, they really haven't mentioned it, and I'm wondering, is this something we'll see on Strange New Worlds?
Yep.
Setting up this hatred of Klingons. And I mean, they talk about the Klingon War quite a bit in Strange New Worlds, so it's like, well, okay, is there, we know Kirk is a lieutenant by the time we meet him in Strange New Worlds, and there's plenty of territory to recover there for him, so it's like, was there something that happened in the war to Kirk specifically that made him this way, made him hate these Klingons this much? And I'd be interested to know, because it comes off as this visceral hatred, and I don't know if it's played up just because they wanted to set up that foil in this episode of like, hey, you're claiming to be the peacekeepers here, but look, you're advocating just as hard as anybody for war. And the thirst for war is really like it's heavy on both sides, and you do see a lot of the similarities between Gore and Kirk. And Gore points it out. He's like, "Hey, you're just like me. I have respect for you because you have real hate. And that I can work with. That I can kind of appreciate." And that's something that I think Star Trek does very well. Is it plays up, kind of the blurred lines between the heroes, the good guys, and the bad guys, and the arch nemesis is like they're often far more similar than they are different, and that's something that I don't think the other large sci-fi franchise does very well. Star Wars is they set up the Jedi and the Sith as kind of these very much opposing forces to each other, but downplay the similarities, in a lot of ways, except for Return of the Jedi. I think that's the one movie that does it very well. The other ones, it's very much good versus evil. The complexity of the storytelling really doesn't come until much later in the Star Wars universe. It's right here, right in the beginning of the Star Trek universe. And I think that's Roddenberry. I think that was his overall message in the height of the Cold War, is that we're a lot more alike than we are different. And that's it's a poignant thing throughout all of the Star Trek franchise movies, except maybe the Kelvin timeline, which should almost be their own thing. But and it's kind of the beauty of Star Trek. It's why their stories, I think, are going to have lasted almost 50 years worth of, standing that kind of test of time. I don't know that A New Hope holds up in the same fashion. I think that A New Hope plays out a lot more like the Westerns of the era, where it was like, the good guys in the white hats, the bad guys in the black hats. You really know who is who. One does heinous things. One is really just sort of the victim for the most part. And that's
All right.
poignant.
You guys sound off on any of these that struck you, because I had a lot of bullet points on this one. The scenes between Kirk and Gore, John Kaliskos and Bill Shatner, to me, we've been going through on our other big show analysis, The Graying Jedi. We've been going through Tony Gilroy's Andor. Make sure you're subscribing and watching those as well, science fiction fans. Their dialogue. This is a dialogue-heavy episode, despite starting off with a big phaser battle. And I loved, by the way, the brief glimpses of the Klingon battle cruiser. Again, the first time I ever saw those was 1979 Star Trek: The Motion Picture. But to see them there firing on the Enterprise in the very beginning, it did warm my heart. But despite all of that, and blowing up a munitions dump, and plenty of action, most of this is dialogue driven, and most of it is between Gore and Kirk, and it reminds me of Andor because they have a delicious back and forth. Have we a ram amongst the sheep? And Kalisko's just like, again, even if you're not familiar with his Battlestar Galactica work, in which he was playing a little bit more of a cliche in that iteration of the series, they did a much better job giving Baltar some real depth in the reboot of Galactica in the early 2000s. But he absolutely, I think if Ricardo Montalban was slaying it as Khan Noonien Singh, I think Kaliskos is 1A or 2 in terms of impressive guest stars on this show and so forth. I like, at no point am I not intimidated by what he intends to do to his prisoners, to the Federation, and so forth. This is not a paper tiger. Like, this is a guy who's serious about being lethal. And I thought their interactions were just tremendous. It's interesting when Kirk is trying to persuade the Organians, which does sound like Leia and Bail Organa and so forth, to Uther's point. he's pitching Roddenberry's utopian moment. We can help you with infrastructure. We can help you with education, supplies. You just need to join our side, which of course falls on deaf ears. But that, if you listen to Kirk's speech, that's basically what Roddenberry's been pitching us, is this interplanetary, federation that will give you a leg up, a lift, because clearly your society, according to our perception, is stagnant, when of course nothing could be further from the truth. And I think we talk about parallels and so forth. There's a lot in here with Kirk and Spock talking about, we've got to get these guys to fight for themselves. We have to do guerrilla warfare, insurgencies. We have to, strike them and make them hurt, make it difficult, if not impossible, to hold the planet. And I mean, we have hindsight again, because this is happening while people were dying over in Southeast Asia at this time. But it's a very strong Vietnam analogy, right? Except Kirk and Spock are talking about, the North Vietnamese, right? The Viet Cong. That's their mindset. Let's make it painful for the West and the United States and the French to hold this ground and territory. Let's get in there and blow up their munitions dumps and ambush them and cause civilian uprisings and so forth. Like, it's an interesting sort of twist of geopolitics. Whereas Kirk and Spock are actually like saying, like, this is how you drive out the colonials and the imperialists and the invaders. And we're on their side, right? We're like, yeah, that's right. Hit them, blow up the munitions dump and start a citizen uprising. When in reality, that's what got us into trouble on the world stage, and not just in Vietnam, but in other conflicts that have happened in the last 40 or 50 years. So I thought that was an interesting subversive. I don't know if it was intended as such, but it certainly stood there. I love that the Klingons printed their decrees in English. Obviously, Mike Okuda and his wife Denise had not yet done the classic Klingon lettering and so forth and language, which some people can speak it fluently. And even write their Christmas cards out in the original Klingon. But I did like that it was like their proclamations that they wanted to install on the planet were all very, very nicely printed in English. I love Kirk's response, go climb a tree. I mean, that's as rough as it gets in 1967. I mean, you aren't allowed to say certain words on television, obviously, but that was pretty there. Hardcore. I'm sure there were some distraught parents saying, go to your rooms, cover your ears. How could he say that there? And why, when you've got your heroes prisoner, they've taken Spock and Kirk prisoner, why do you put them in the same cell? I mean, you're just asking for them to escape. Like, why is it like, put them with the other, put them with the Vulcan? And it's like, come on, the two of them putting their heads together, they're going to figure out a way to get out of this.
Right.
So that's kind of silly. Like, keep them isolated, keep them separated, keep them confused. But so that's just villainry 101 there, is just don't put them in the same. And when they were locked up, it made me mad because it was only a couple of episodes ago where Spock was able, I think it was A Taste of Armageddon, where he was able to manipulate and mind meld through solid walls in order to convince guards to let them go. But here that power has either mysteriously vanished or he's under such stress that he doesn't remember he can do that because they're sort of trapped in this cell. And it's like, there's no way out, Jim. These walls are too thick. And maybe that's what's doing it here. I'll answer my own question. Maybe the walls were too thick for Spock to successfully perform the remote mind meld telekinesis that he did. But like I say, writers, put this stuff down in your script Bibles and then stick to it because it is frustrating for fans when all of a sudden it's like, wait, I thought he could get out of this, like, no problem. And the poor, I felt bad for the poorly painted goat early on. They had the whole medieval times thing going again. They're like, we need an intergalactic goat here. And they slap some blue and green paint on it. And it's just standing there as a goat would, wondering when its next meal will come and when it can be released and go graze. But I just felt bad. I'm sure they just literally said, paint that goat. And then afterwards, I don't know what they did. Like I'm saying now, get that paint off the goat. But that made me sad. And then this was fun. Spock, when the Oregonians reveal themselves as these godlike, even for a show that's given us godlike omnipotent beings, these guys take the cake because they can literally disable the Klingon Empire and Starfleet just by thinking it. So, these guys are pretty high up, I think, on the God scale as far as ethereal beings that have, unlimited power. But there's a point where Spock says the words pure energy. And that audio sample of Leonard Nimoy, was put in the famous 1988 song, What's on Your Mind, from Information Society. And it's been played in nightclubs and bars and MTV for 30 years. And friends, use the Google machine and play a sample of 1988's What's on Your Mind from Information Society, and you'll hear a thrumming techno beat that's pretty good to dance to, but you'll also hear repeated sampling of pure energy. And that was Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock, and that was taken from this episode. And now I have that answer. So, and when he says it on the show, it sounds exactly like the dance hit, pure energy. So I thought that was kind of cool there.
He also brings up the odds again, or Kirk asks him the odds.
It's a recurring.
And he's very specific. And they make another joke of it. And then later on, Kirk takes down a Klingon and he's like, our odds have improved,
Yes.
Or Spock says that. So I feel like they went to the well a second time. And is our universe just filled with Q-like beings? And where are they? Have they been here? Because it's like every other week we're getting a Q-like being. But like we brought up before, there aren't reruns. Like it's easy, to try and put ourselves in that time period. Maybe it was easy to go to the well on something like that because it wasn't going to be remembered week to week, where I'm sure if we went back right now and counted, what is this, the 5th or 6th time we've come across these beings that can just do whatever by thinking it, like snap of the fingers. Yeah.
And it's super interesting because Next Gen didn't do that. Deep Space Nine didn't do that. Voyager didn't do that. You'd get one or two a series or one or two a season, maybe, where there would be some sort of semi-omnipotent being, and it's just like, is this a Q? And then there'd be some explanation why they aren't Q, and it's like, how many of these exist? Like, how is this possible?
I saw an interview with John Delancey. Did I say it right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And he said he had a conversation with Roddenberry because Roddenberry, I guess, wanted to make him like a more frequent. He wanted him to be on multiple times during a season. And after they had the conversation, they both came to the conclusion that he couldn't do that because it would be too much. Like you wouldn't be able to appreciate it. It would look, it almost might become like the Q show versus Star Trek. And so that's when they decided to kind of put some space in there as to when Q would appear. But I thought it was interesting that Roddenberry at first was like, oh yeah, you're going to be on like 5 or 6 times a season. And then they decided that was way too much. So, which we can see that here. Like you could possibly see the effect of it as to, if these beings could just do this, like what's their purpose? And that's been my question with Q, which I felt they kind of tried to address a little bit in Picard season 2, like the idea of his purpose. But anyway, that's a whole nother podcast.
Let's not forget, Sulu gets command and does a pretty good job, mind you. Not Scotty this episode, but the helmsman gets the Enterprise out of trouble and then back into trouble. And the actor who played the leader of the Organians, his name is John Abbott. And it's, for most of the episode, you're really frustrated with him because he's just a very calm demeanor and very one note. And you can sense Kirk's frustration at him. Like, don't you understand? You're endangered, man. Danger. But then when the reveal comes, and that works absolutely like, hey, little human, we could squash you, in a bug, in seconds. So don't mess around with us. Take your war somewhere else. Stay out of our sector of space. I thought he was. I thought again very compelling. We had two very compelling acting performances beyond the usual crew in this, with Kaliskos as Gore and John Abbott as this leader. But Abbott's it hits you late because again you're just sort of frustrated with him for 3/4 of this, and then when they finally reveal their powers, you're like, oh my gosh, these guys, I don't even want to mess with him. So I thought that was a great job with casting. For both those, to have two strong guest stars in the same episode. It's like having Stellan Skarsgård and Forrest Whitaker, who just appeared in this past week's Andor together. So, which you can watch both on Disney Plus for the episode and on pending rebrand, the Warp Core the Graying Jedi podcast. So,
hit that subscribe button. Make sure to click notify. Stay up to date.
So there you go. All right.
Well, gentlemen, I believe we've reached that time where we should give each episode our Warp Core ratings out of 7. Lord Uther, how about you kick us off this week?
Hey. All right. I'll go. I got to start putting these into context a little bit more. I'm gonna go 6 out of 7. It was a great episode. I think what I'm looking to do now is maybe up the ante in terms of what I think is going to be a 7 out of 7, because they probably all could be. Maybe enough red shirts didn't die in this episode to make it a 6 out of 7. I don't know. Like, there's a whole line of them down there. But I'll go 6 out of 7 on that one. And then the second one, I'll go. I want to say 6 out of 7 again, but I'll go 6 out of 7 again, just because I think I need to up what I'm looking for in a show. What would I have liked to have seen a little different in this one? Probably not much. I don't know. So I'm just going to go 6. I'm going to go double 6s here. So go ahead, Inner Space.
Okay. I think Devil in the Dark. I mean, I want to knock points off for the creature, but I'm not going to, because I did feel what it was trying to tell us. And again, I'm a shameless horror movie fan, so I get what they were going with. I like what they were putting down, the cut of their jib. So we'll go 6 for The Devil in the Dark. Last week I'm on the record, again, check out last week's episode of the Warp Core, saying that A Taste of Armageddon is an all-time classic. But I think there's really a lot of strong stuff here in Errand of Mercy. So I'm going to go a 7 on Errand of Mercy. I mean, for my personal tastes, I had riveting dialogue. I had special effects in the beginning. I had a real, like, how are they going to get out of this again? Sort of thing, because the villainry was so strong. I don't see any weaknesses, structurally or otherwise, with this one. Just fabulous work by Gino Kuhn and the team, and I think this is a really strong episode of Trek. It'll be curious if it makes my cut for the best first season episode, which we'll be doing in the not too distant future here on the Warp Core. So stay tuned for that. So 6 and a 7.
And I'm going to echo your sentiments as well, Tuck Pendleton. I'm going to go with 6 out of 7 and 7 out of 7. I think both episodes are truly fantastic. This whole season has been exceptional for the most part. But Errand of Mercy, I think it has so much going on for it. And especially given the time period that it came out, feels really important in Star Trek canon. And it's really a universal message, which I think Star Trek does very well. So I think that is just, again, not just foundational, but essential Star Trek. If this season 1 weren't so loaded, that might be the pick for the best episode of the season. But it's certainly going to be a tough call this first season to pick out a number 1 overall. And we still have a couple episodes to go. So if you haven't and you want to keep up to date, make sure you're clicking that subscribe button, Hit that notification button to stay up to date with all our pending rebrand content, because we're not just the Warp Core podcast or the Graying Jedi podcast or the Meltoff podcast or Cut the Cheese, Poke the Bear. We also drop Cinebits with fun factoids from your favorite films and all sorts of good stuff. Not to mention our routine shorts of silliness that should brighten anybody's day. But especially here on the Warp Core podcast, we want to make sure that everybody walks away entertained, informed, and live long and prosper.